Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Stir Crazy podcast. I'm your host, as always, Rob Nelson.
And I'm Mike Bachov. And hey, Rob, do you know why photographers are known for their temper?
I don't know, but I think you're going to tell me.
Well, because they're just known to snap at any given moment.
God, again. Wouldn't be
it
wouldn't be the start to a show without a Mike Bachov pun.
It was either that one or something about negatives, and I decided not to go there.
Yeah, okay.
So today we're talking about photography.
Yeah, we're going to be talking with Carrie Stouffer and Sam Stump from our curatorial department. And then later on in the show, we're going to have a special guest in Terry Winslow, who is a photographer from Grand Island and formerly worked in the Lombard-Loshinsky studio.
Yeah, Terry told some excellent stories about his time in Grand Island. He's got some deep roots in this community and just some very heartwarming anecdotes about being a photographer and that person who had that connection to people for so long. So yeah, it's going to be a educational and uplifting show, I think, for a change, right?
Yeah, and we are going to be shooting this episode live from the photo archives in our Reynolds building at the Stuhr Museum. This is where our Julius Loshinsky photo collection is housed. So we thought it best to talk about this topic while next to this topic.
And yeah, photos everywhere. So, all right. So this is going to be quite the journey. Looking forward to it.
Let's dive right in. Welcome to the Stir Crazy podcast. I'm Rob Nelson. I'm here with Carrie Stouffer and Samantha Stump from our curatorial team. Today we are going to be talking about Julius Loshinsky and the famous photography collection that we have here at Stuhr Museum. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So when we talk about Julius Loshinsky, some of our listeners might be familiar with that name, but for those who aren't, who is Julius Loshinsky and what is his story in this community?
Well, Julius Loshinsky was a huge photographer from about 1880s till his death, which was in 1937. But he just wasn't active during the time he was in Grand Island, but his stepbrother was also active, his nephews, all of his family. So really, it started with Michael Murphy, who sold his business to Loshinsky, and then Loshinsky's family, the Lombards, took over. And so really, most families in Grand Island and in Hall County are going to have photographs in their home personal collections that attach in one way or another to Julius Loshinsky.
The Loshinsky family, in terms of like the legacy of like down through the ages, there were several Loshinskys who were interested or pursued photography. Isn't that right?
Yeah, actually, it's pretty pervasive throughout all of the generations. So like I said, Julius Loshinsky's brother was involved, his children. He had two boys, and both of them were on their way to pursuing photography. And then a lot of his nephews, different people got involved with photography and carried on the legacy.
Yeah, I think his brother's name was Max. He was originally in the business with his brother Julius.
Yep.
Two of his sons.
There was Oswald and Armand.
Yeah, one died during World War I, unfortunately, and then another one died fairly early in his life as well, in his 30s, I believe.
Yeah, he was 37. Armand was in World War I, and he died of pneumonia.
Yeah.
And then Oswald was really on his way to becoming a photographer and had actually won some awards and was actually doing some exhibits with his father. Had just gotten married, and he passed away at 37. So that kind of influenced Loshinsky in that time period too. And I think he really relied heavily on the medium of photography to get through some of those things. And so we have a pervasive amount of material that he produced.
How many photos does Stuhr Museum have the ownership rights to?
So I did just a little research so that I could get all of the numbers right, because normally we talk about 25,000, or we might say 22,000, or we might say things like that.
Sure.
And those are glass plate negatives, so that takes up a significant amount of space. But I went back to the original donation, which was from the Lombard-Loshinsky studio when they moved in the 80s. They moved locations, and they donated a bunch. And I was able to pull up that we have 4,000 photographic prints 2 daguerreotypes, 2 ambrotypes, about 396 to 456 lantern slides,
Wow.
11 to 22 tin types, 87 to 190 zinc woodcuts, and then the glass plates are estimated between 24,000 and 28,000 of different sizes of glass plate negatives.
There's a history lesson just in what you just said. all those different types of photography and just the evolution of photographs were cataloged or made in just the span of a few decades. All those things came out kind of in rapid succession, all of which were trying to compete with one another to be the most easy to use, functional, those sorts of things, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. It was kind of like technology in the computer age where you got a new software program and a new this and a new that. And then all of a sudden you've got a whole new brand of computer, and it just kind of was progressing at that kind of speed.
You mentioned a little while ago, Leshinsky, in our collection, we have some of his awards, trophies, ribbons, medals, those sorts of things. Just in my own personal research, I found that he had awards from the local level in Grand Island, at the county level, at the state level, at the regional level, at the national level. What do you think it was about Julius that set him apart from other photographers of this era?
There were a lot of things that he did that other photographers didn't do. One thing was most photographers focused on portraits of individuals and families. And Julius Leshinsky actually went around and took pictures of businesses and of events going on. So he did a lot more than the average photographer did. He went out of the studio and into the town, and he got to know people, and he did all kinds of things, group photos, and just a lot of
He took pictures of dogs. He took pictures of cats. He took picture of Christmas ornaments. He took autopsy photographs for the county. He just pretty much anything that he could get in front of his viewfinder.
Sure.
We have an example of.
Yeah.
Which is pretty incredible because taking photographs and producing the prints took a lot of time and effort for each one. We forget that it's not just as easy as the point and shoot that we do today and store 300 on our cameras.
Sure.
It was a significant amount of work, and he would put that work, the same work he would put into taking a portrait that someone was paying for. I mean, we have a picture of a cat that's sitting on a chair.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's kind of neat.
Yeah, we have pictures of like window displays from businesses, like a line of refrigerators, or a display of candy, or even displays from his own studio.
What I'm hearing from both of you speak is that he had to have seen himself as more than just a professional photographer who was performing a job. He had to have seen himself as more artistically driven and motivated. At this point in the early years of photography, I feel like there was this interesting dichotomy of, photography was an art form, but it was also a science. And there was this kind of back and forth between the two visions for the path photography was going to take. And, some people thought that, photography should be used as a medium to catalog the world, and there should only be photos of things that, we needed for, posterity and for factual evidence in different scientific fields. And maybe this is a part of what Leshinsky is doing with all of these different photos that he took. But I guess I would ask both of you if you think that he saw himself, if he saw himself as more an artist or somebody who was trying to just get as many photos as he could because he cared about his community and wanted to see all of it represented.
I think it probably is a mixture, which, is the easy answer.
Yeah.
But he, I think, was very interested in the process and very interested in the chemistry and the science behind it, like you said. But at the same time, he framed artwork. He was in touch with those that were doing artwork in the community. We have several pieces in our collection, where the file talks about an etching or a painting that's significant, and then always it says framed by Leshinsky. Yeah, he definitely had a bead, whether he knew it or not, on I think, the heart of art and creativity and imagination. But I think he was just so involved and excited about the process and the work that I'm not sure that we don't have a lot of comments about how he felt about it. I'm sure he had hours and hours of conversations because he went to every single photography convention there could possibly be.
Yeah.
And he won several awards. So I'm sure he told people.
Speaking of such a large collection, 28,000 objects plus, perhaps, we're sitting here live in the Reynolds building at Stuhr Museum where our photo archive is. Carrie or Sam, you've spent a lot of time over here researching, documenting, cataloging, all of those things. How does a museum team care for a collection like a glass plate negative, a highly delicate object for, perpetuity?
We can't tell because we have masks on, but we're laughing a little. That's a lot to take care of.
Mm-hmm.
We are very fortunate that, Hall County has supported us and our constituents have supported us, that we have an archive. We have a separate vault where we can keep these things. Most importantly, in a climate controlled situation, is that the kind of thing you're looking for? Is like, how do you... So we do manage the temperature and the humidity. We have a special fire suppression system because a lot of these things, were made with they may not have been unstable at the time, but as they age, they become unstable.
Sure.
Right.
So we have a very specific plan for fire, disasters, things like that. Beyond that, I think what's most important, even though you could go on and on about all those little details, is that Stuhr Museum is protecting them, keeping them safeguarded until there is technology, time, resources, people, energy to safely reproduce them.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at a glass plate, it's kind of it's fuzzy. It's not real clear because you can see the contrasts, and depending on what they've put on the glass, depending on how it's degraded, depending on accretions, all of that, it may be hard to see, but you can scan those in. And so the important part, I think, is that Stuhr Museum is making sure that they're handled correctly, they're stored long-term correctly, until somebody can really put some major effort into sitting and scanning 28,000 individual 5x7 glass plate negatives.
Yep. Which takes a special scanner.
It takes a special scanner.
Yeah.
And a lot of patience.
Yeah, a special kind of person, too.
A special kind of person.
Very careful.
And, at different points in times, we've been able to do sections.
Sure.
And so but it would be nice. Someday, I think everybody that's worked at Stuhr Museum has dreamed about being able to see them all at one time.
Yeah.
And piece by piece, it's coming together a little bit because several of the photos that are on exhibit in the Stuhr building and different places on our grounds are Leshinsky negatives that have been scanned and blown up into the photos that they are right now on display.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of see photography as today still this medium that provides two functions, both scientific and artistic. And I don't know that that's something that any other art form does off the top of my head. So I was going to ask both of you, since you're both artists, if you could think of another, not necessarily scientific, but an art form that can preserve history while at the same time being, artistic in its own right.
Well, I think that definitely in the past, even way before photography, if you had the ability to sketch, a lot of scientific discoveries were recorded in journals.
Oh, sure.
Just as pictures drawn. That was the first anybody had ever seen of certain animals, and as they were exploring the world, and they wanted to make sure that they captured the likeness. I mean, you see like ancient depictions of things that you could somewhat describe as maybe an elephant, that someone had described an elephant to someone at the time, and they were like, well, I've never seen that, but I bet I could draw it.
Yeah.
And they tried. But
yeah, I think that raises a very good point. I mean, definitely, I think history, science, and art, math, I think they've always had a connection.
Mhm.
I don't know that anything quite like photography has caused as much conflict or argument, as to whether it is art or science, whether it
Mhm.
is documentation or whether it can be art, or if you use Photoshop, does that count? Or if you print your own negative or you develop or use chemicals, does that count? And there are a lot of heated discussions about that. On my way to this point where I was at, I've had different opinions at different times.
Yeah.
So
I can
it is a unique art form,
Mhm.
a unique way of marking down history, and yet it's also what we all live by.
Yeah.
It's also very young in comparison to anything else. I mean, photography hasn't even been around for 200 years yet.
Absolutely.
Roughly. It's very, very young in terms of how old all the other forms are.
It's not necessarily, it's not an American invention or whatever, but it does kind of track with American history in terms of age.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way that I feel people think America has been around forever, I feel like maybe they do kind of think photography's been around forever as well. And they really haven't.
Right.
They just haven't. 150 years, 200 years is just not that much time. And you kind of, if you sit down and think about it, it's just a blink of an eye, in my opinion. Anyway.
Absolutely. In relationship to the rest of the world and to the indigenous people, it is completely a blink of an eye.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's at its first stages, and yet it's moved very quickly through those first stages, I think.
Yeah.
Although none of us know what it's going to look like in another 100 years.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think in this, we have a unique artifact in our collection that I think kind of highlights right where this kind of issue was coming into conversation of the times that it was created. In the 1860s, there's a thing called crayon portraiture or crayon enlargement. Would you walk us through what that is and just kind of talk about where, the origin of that art form?
Well, actually, I think you've done the most research on it.
I can definitely talk about it.
I think that, and we have a specific piece in our collection that you are going to exhibit as part of a permanent exhibit that'll be up for 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
So I think you should share with everyone your kind of ideas about that.
Okay. Thank you, Carrie. Maybe I'll do that.
Was that subtle enough, Rob?
So crayon enlargement, I've found this to be a really cool thing. I had no idea what it was beforehand, so I'm no expert. Anyone who's a photography expert out there is probably going to rake me over the coals. But essentially, there were cameras called solar cameras that would take a photograph and blow it up into a larger, fainter image on canvas or a special type of paper. And they would be the first life-size images that would be quote-unquote photographs that people could purchase. And it was, in a time when the only thing available would have been a portrait on like a 5x7 catalog card. These were, revolutionary. You could have maybe a 2 foot by 3 foot image of yourself. But the downside of these images were that it created a faint image that had imperfections on it, blemishes on it, tonal differences that didn't quite look right. So what the crayon enlargement refers to is after the photo was taken, a artist would later come in and using charcoal, using watercolor, using pastel, would illustrate that image and make it appear kind of like this hybrid between a photograph and a hand-drawn drawing. And depending on how talented the artist was, that's how great of a piece you ultimately were given at the end of the process. And we have one that hung in Julius Leshinsky's studio for a number of years in our collection, and it's a really fabulous piece that dates to 1895. This medium, crayon portraiture or crayon enlargement, was popular from the 1860s until the turn of the century in the 1900s. So right around that time is where you kind of see the modern take hold from the old school way of photographing. So yeah, just kind of this, it starts off as this science with this camera that's kind of different and unique, trying to do something different. And then you still have to have like an artist hand physically come in and change it to be.
Which they had several different forms, like with the lantern slides and stuff. But I'm going to put a plug here that you can take a photography class during our summer schools to learn how to do that process.
Really?
Yep. So and I guess we know where Rob's going to be this summer.
I might. I found it to be really interesting, and I still can't. I don't think this is how my mind works. I just can't really comprehend how you use sunlight to capture and blow up an image into a larger image on another piece of paper. I don't know that my brain really computes that all that well, so I hope that was easy enough to follow. But
I think I took a class like that out here when I was a kid, and none of my photos turned out. But
really,
I must have just done it wrong.
Well, it does depend on whether it's a sunny day or a cloudy day. It depends on your aperture and how large of a hole you're focusing the image through. It's old science, and yet, like you said, not super old science, but
exactly.
It's a fascinating process, and I really like the concept of the fascination with documenting it in a very factual way. This is from real life, and then embellishing it or representing it, however you want to talk about it, into a fully interpretable image is fascinating. And then I also like how you are thinking about the next transition and how, all of that was kind of the photographer knew how to do that, or the artist knew how to do that, or a very select few knew how to do that. The chemistry people knew how to do that. The darkroom people knew what to do. And then it changes pretty quickly into something that everybody can do.
Yeah.
And we have the Brownie cameras and we have all of that. And I think that's another transition that you were very interested in exploring.
Yeah, I love the idea of just these things that were professions that somebody dedicated their lives to being made applicable to people in their everyday lives. The ability for a medium like photography, where it once, the first modern photograph with a camera that would be recognizable to us, taken in France in 1826, took 8 hours to photograph. And then you slowly but surely over time take that down to, maybe 30 minutes, 15 minutes, a couple minutes, maybe 30 seconds, 15 seconds. And then by the time you have cameras in the early 20th century, it's a handheld portable camera, similar to something like we might have now. You can have an image that you pull away from the camera after it's taken, and here's your photo. That maybe that took 100 years, but again, that's not that much time. And
no, it really progressed from, a very select few to a very larger group. And then now it's to the point where, you have that device, which you can also call your mom on. So
a phone that is like the thing you use least is the actual phone on your phone.
Right. And they will develop into really high quality images and also downloadable images where you can then apply any artwork you want to it. And you don't even just have to manipulate it by computer. Mm-hmm. You can include it in collages, and you can draw on it, and you can do chemical applications to that as well. So really, the options and the opportunities just keep exploding.
Yeah. I'll kind of close this conversation out with more physical objects. We have, as we said, an extensive amount of photos from Julius Leshinsky's collection here at the museum, and there are no two people who work at Stuhr Museum who would know more or seen more images of this collection firsthand. So I'm just wondering if you have, either of you, a favorite photo or a few photos that have really stood out to you over the years that you've worked here that you've come to love and admire.
I have so many favorite photos.
I'm sure.
And I think my opinion changes every time I see a new photo. Because we have a lot of photos that we've just never seen before. So we pull a folder out of a box and we're like, oh, that's an interesting photo. But we have, our ranges are enormous. Like I was talking about the candy display photo, and it's one of the most beautiful photos I've seen. And, not just because of my sweet tooth, but it's actually a gorgeous photo. Photos of people with dogs, people with their pets, and I love those photos. I love group shots because everybody is doing something different all the time. I think that's so much fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you asked us this ahead of time. However, it didn't help me in any way, shape, or form. I think I've narrowed it down to appreciating most the family pictures he did. He has a lot of photos with his wife and his 2 children at Christmas, at dinner, doing normal things with their first car, working on the first car. And those are really intimate insights into his life, into that family dynamic, and to how much they cared about each other. And you don't see that from that time period, before, we're talking before 1920. Not to the extent that he has it. I mean, he has 4 or 5 pictures of all of the presents that they opened from Christmas are all opened and displayed under the tree, with a cat hanging out in there. So yeah, and then I think what's fascinating about that is he's so clear, like with the candy pictures and stuff like that, that you can get in and you can read how much, if there's a tag on a Christmas item, you can read how much they spent on that. Or if it came from Sears and Roebuck, you can see what's in there, and you can really develop a whole picture around the picture that he has. You can tell whether Armand is happy about his gifts or not.
Sure.
Or trying to hide it, or all those different things. So that's what I really appreciate, is the detail and the ability to capture things that, of course, we all take pictures of our Christmas tree now. But you would be surprised, there are very few pictures of the family Christmas tree from that time.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for being here. I think we'll hit pause there, and we'll be back after this. We'll be talking with Terry Winslow, local photographer from Grand Island, Nebraska. So stick with us, and we'll be back after these words.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Mukau and Congrove Hardware Catalog Store. For the finest line of mixed paints and general hardware, visit the Mukau and Congrove Hardware Catalog Store on Depot Street, just west of the Merrick Planing Mill. Mukau and Congrove have stoves in many styles and offer supplies for both the farm and the home. They have a large selection of catalog sources and offer to be your clearinghouse for catalog orders.
Hi, this is Terry.
Hi, Terry. This is Rob Nelson calling, Stuhr Museum. How you doing?
I'm good.
Hey, and Terry, this is Mike Bachov.
Sure.
Might be yelling some questions at you.
Okay, that'd be fine.
Yeah, but we appreciate you doing this. I know you have quite the history with photography here in Grand Island.
Yeah, I've been a photographer in Grand Island since 1968.
Wow.
When I came back from college and started working back at Lombard Lashinsky's.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. You, in our previous conversation, I think you said you worked there for 17 years.
Yes,
What do you think the legacy of that studio has been on the history of the Grand Island community? And do you take a personal stake in that legacy, having worked there for so long?
Well, I think the stake in Grand Island was really started by Julius when he became so active in the Liederkranz Association and the Businessmen's Association early on in his career in Grand Island. He was a very active member of the community, did lots of things for the community, as well as the photography association that it belonged to. As for me, I did have a lot of invested in that. I started out as a children's photographer, used to photograph about 3,000 children a year in what was called the Aunt Mary Birthday Club program, and photographed the same kids for about 5 years in their birthday month each year.
Okay, so just doing the math, what does 3,000 kids a year break down to per day?
Well, we only photographed children 5 days a week, So essentially we had to do, it was a lot of kids, and it wasn't only me. There were two of us that were actually doing them. So we opened up at 9 o'clock in the morning and closed at 6 o'clock in the evening, and we were photographing children all day, about every 15 to 25 minutes.
How many times did you say cheese in that day?
Yeah, it was a long day.
Yeah.
It was always long days there, and it was a constant flow through. It was quite a program. A lady locally was selling the program, and she was very active at selling it. It was actually a national program through Lyle Ramsey Corporation, which they actually started the whole baby club program, and it worked really well. So I had my hands full, and eventually I had two other women that took over when I became the manager of the studio, doing the children photography, because I moved up to photographing family groups and seniors then at that time.
And so these are primarily portraits then, correct?
Right. They're all portraits. There basically was kind of a theme for everybody in the year. I know a lot of the parents of what would be a young family today, or even a medium-aged family today, can probably be remembered photographed in the white chair. We had a chair that was, at that time, was probably 85 years old, and almost every child that was photographed had been photographed in that chair throughout the years. And it actually was a baby chair from the 1880s, where they actually tied the babies into the chair so they didn't fall out.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a lengthy history of that kind of what would today be seen as torture, I think, for children. They had that with like dentistry chairs and apparently photography chairs
not only
as well.
the children but the adults.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that was to help hold because in the early years, exposure times would be anywhere from 1 to as long as 15 seconds, and then able to remain immobile so that you didn't have a blurry face. You actually would be leaning against a support that would keep your head steady and still. So you only had to worry about not blinking your eyes in that length of time.
Wow. And I feel like a portraiture, that's got to tie your profession in very well to like the time of the Leszczynskis themselves, because wasn't portraiture at that time just as time consuming a venture?
Oh yes, I mean in the early days when Julius first came to Grand Island, he actually had a wagon, horse-drawn wagon, and the darkroom was in the wagon, and he used to set up a tent and photograph in a tent.
Really?
Pretty much where the location of the studio actually was.
How did a windy day impact that sort of process?
Well, there were conditions that it wasn't good. So
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't imagine that would be real good.
the heat and everything else. Now, that location was only there, I think, for. I never got a really clear answer about how long that location was there, but I think it was there for less than a year, and then they purchased the land and built a building at that time, and it was kind of like the 1880 frontier buildings. It was pretty much a wooden shanty to begin with.
Yeah. What sort of process did Leszczynski originally employ to take photographs? I know we have most of his glass plate negative collection. Could you kind of walk us through about like what a glass plate is and how an image is recorded on a glass plate?
Sure. The glass plates actually evolved from the old Derriere type. Actually, there were a lot of different types of photographs taken. The Derriere type is the one that is most familiar with most people. There was also an albumen type print, which was actually a positive that had a mirror put behind it, which caused the darkened mirror caused the image to come through on the white albumen emulsion that was on the glass itself. Fox Talbot in England actually developed the emulsion type glass plate, actually about in the 1870s, I believe it was. and it was a development process that used a chemical process to process the silver halide that was sensitive to light in the emulsion itself, and the glass was just the substrate to hold all of that in place while you made the print. And then it was developed in chemicals. The early process, which I'm sure Julius probably used early in his career, actually used mercury fumes to develop the plates.
Oh, wow.
That was part of the Dierry-Guerre process, and that's why there were so many photographers that went mad and died at an early age because of handling mercury fumes.
I was about to say that is not a healthy way to make a living at that point. Yeah.
No, it was dangerous.
So would the mercury it would have been heated then? That's what the...
Right. To produce the fumes, it would have been heated. Ideally, it would have been heated in something that we would call a fume cabinet now, with the plate hanging there, and they wouldn't even have been in the room while they were doing it. But I'm sure that if you look at the history of it, that you'd find that there were a lot of photographers that died from this process just from inhaling the fumes.
Wow.
So, but the chemical process was developed was much safer because it used a developing agent which was normally potassium bromide. It was regulated with sodium sulfite to control the contrast and the development time so that it was a reasonable length of time. And then after that developed, and there were other chemicals involved too, methyl and a number of other different things, all to do certain things when you developed it. After the plate was submerged in this solution for a length of time, a specific length of time, then it would go into an acetic acid bath, which was very mild. It was, less than the strength of about half the strength of vinegar. And then it went into a fixing solution that washed away all of the unused silver halide crystals, which gave you the negative for you to start printing from.
Wow.
So would that limit the type of photography you could do?
No, not really.
Okay.
The emulsions were very, very slow at that time, and that was the reason for the long exposure times. You had to expose the plate to light for a certain length of time in order for you to get a usable image off of it. And in the early days, that could be 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds, but you could actually go outside in bright sunlight. If you were out in bright sunlight, your exposures would be relatively short. And then you would have to control the development of the plate in order to keep it from getting too dark and making it too hard to print. So, no, it was just a matter of you had to know the technique, you had to know your processes, you had to know how to handle your camera. And pretty much like today, I mean, it's pretty much the same thing. It's a lot easier for us now because we can look back at the camera and tell if we got it or didn't get it. They didn't have that ability. And they also, many of them were making their own glass plates, which means they were mixing this up. They would have to spread the emulsion on the plate. They would have to let the plate dry. It would go into a holder that went into the camera, and so if they ruined it, they had to start all over. Now, they reused the glass many times. If they had a failure there, they just washed the emulsion off the glass plate and started over again.
You took upwards of maybe 3,000 pictures a day?
No, not a day. A year.
A year. Okay.
A year.
How many? 3,000 pictures a year. How many with this sort of process could we have created in the same amount of time, like a year? Because this sounds just like such a labor intensive.
Oh.
It
was a lot more labor intensive until the cellulose negative stock came into being, which was in the late 1920s, I believe, and it became commercially processed, so you didn't have to stand and make your own plates and stuff. But up into the early 1900s, that was still a fairly common process into the early 1900s, where you would be making your own plates. Although there were companies that were making glass plates and selling them, but they were expensive, and you could make your own for much less money, which, when photographs were essentially a 5x7 cabinet card, would sell for a dozen would sell for $1, which was a lot of money in those at that time, of course. But by today's standards, you're a dozen photographs in that size, you're looking at probably $150, $200. So
Sure.
it's all relative.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I asked is because, if I'm not mistaken, one of the signatures of Leshinsky's style, and Rob's going to get into this a little bit more, is that he took pictures of things that from the early days of like businesses that other photographers might just have skipped. And that's what I was always told. And as the non-expert, I'm not sure. A, can you confirm that? And B, why do you think he did that?
I'm sure that in my understanding from his nephew, who was Carl Lombard, who owned the studio at the time when I was working there, he was very proud of his community, and that's the reason why I was so active. So if a new business came along, he would go out and photograph the business. And I'm sure a lot of it was just a promotional thing to look here's a picture of your business. You want to buy this, and then they would take pictures of the family groups, and he did a lot of families. And of course, he was active in the Liederkrantz. If you go through some of those personal files, you'll find quite a few parties at the Liederkrantz.
Sure.
If you go through the rest of the file, you'll find a lot of commercial site photographs, a lot of scenes of Grand Island, parades, parties, all sorts of different things, because he was so active and photographed so many different things. And he stayed up relatively, as far as I could tell, he stayed pretty much up to date with his equipment and with the processes as he moved along.
You see it now with, the modernization of photography, these amateurs or maybe professionals as well, kind of hearkening back to the older days and using some of these older cameras like a Brownie camera or something, just to be a little bit different. Are there methods from, this period of Leshinsky, which is, late 19th century into the 19 teens, 20s, maybe early 30s, that you see that are kind of having a resurgence today at all?
Well, what you see is they're still using film. Had a different quality to it than a digital image has. A digital image tends to be a little bit contrastier than a film image. Film also could preserve a lot more detail than digital does because of its pixel-based. Even with a large pixel camera, you're losing certain amounts of detail because you've got that transition from one edge of a pixel to the next edge of a pixel. It isn't a smooth transition; it's a direct cutoff, and so consequently, you have a smoother tone in film, and people are trying to capture that. But what a lot of people are missing, and a lot of professionals, especially younger professionals, that say, I'm going to buy this old Hasselblad camera because the optics were so good and everything else. Well, they take their film and they have their film developed, and then the first thing they do is they scan the negatives and digitize it. They've lost everything that they would have had from the effect of the film if they would have printed it in an old-fashioned enlarger and developed it in a tray, but they're trying to make it easy so that they can do their work on their computer, do all their adjustments and everything else. But again, they've taken an analog type system and turned it into a digital system, which is, again, breaking it down. And then they wonder why. I watch a couple of landscape YouTube people that have been doing this for about 3 months, and they don't seem to get the fact that conversion is what changes it. You have to use the old processes, and there are some people that are still doing that. I still know how to do that. I haven't done it in a while. I even know how to mix all the chemicals up because it's hard to find the chemicals, but I know which ones to mix up with which to make those processes work. And that's what they need to do. They need to go back to that old style if they want that look.
Well, you raise an interesting point about this artistry, I guess, that people are trying to harken back to again, and they're trying to create something unique and different, I guess.
It is possible. You can do a lot of things with it digitally, but essentially you're destroying the images by softening them. You're never going to get that exact same transition quality in the tonal values out of a digital image, no matter how hard you try. And a lot of people do try, and there's a lot of processes being sold out there that claim, oh, this is just as good. But when you start enlarging it, the detail is just lost. You just can't get the kind of detail. So, it's good and it's bad. It's what it is now, because there are so few people that even know how to do it. So,
it sounds like, how do you want to put it? The idea that photography is now a lot more disposable. That you can take 20 photos of the same thing and then decide which one you like best is almost anathema to what you had to do for years and years and years. You had to set it up. There was some artistry to it. You had to know the chemicals. You had to know the process. And now it's just click, 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 right?
Right. Yeah. That's one thing that really has changed a lot, because when I first came back from college and photographed, you had to remember that every time you push the button, it cost you $1.
Wow. So
it was $1 to take this picture. It's $1 for the next picture. It's $1 for the next one. So you had to be really careful. And now, with digital, well, you're just going to erase it and you're going to reuse the space on your card, so it doesn't make any difference. You just shoot, 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 shoot. So it's what we call spray and pray, which is you just fill your camera full of images and then go through them and hope that there's the one that you can use.
Spray and pray.
I like that.
I had one other question I wanted to ask, and that's just about kind of the origins of photography and like how it's become that, but where it started. Now it might be spray and pray, but I feel like originally there were all these questions about what photography was going to be. Is it going to be this mechanism to be used for posterity and to only take pictures of certain things that really were, people wanted to endure and catalog, or is it going to be this art form and, be this new medium of artwork? Would you happen to know if Leshinsky saw himself as an artist, as a photographer, as like an artist, or more of like a practical profession, and it was his craft, as like a plumber that's his craft?
My understanding from Carl and from Stanley, who was also his other nephew that was in the studio at that time, Stanley Lombard, he considered himself an artist. He also considered himself a astute business person.
Okay.
Too. So he had a business head about him, but he considered himself an artist, and he used to do a lot of staging of the backgrounds and everything else to enhance the photograph, as you probably have seen in a lot of those. Not so much as personal file as the other portraits in the files. Also, he was very good in composition. If you go through the photographs, it wasn't he just stood a camera up and took a picture. He usually had a feeling for a composition in that photograph all the way through. And then he also was a technician. He was very good at processing the film. He used to do much of that himself. His son Oswald worked in the studio for quite a while. I'm sure he did quite a bit of that also.
That answers my question.
Yeah.
It was definitely something I was curious about, because it's just kind of, he existed at this sort of original phase when photography was becoming part of everyday life in a way that it hadn't been even a few decades before he lived. So
I was going to say, before we get off the line, do you have any story that stands out just from so many years of photography in Grand Island? Anything that sticks in your mind that is either, wow, I can't believe I was part of that, or that was odd, or that was funny, or just any story that jumps out at you?
Well, as far as my career goes,
yeah,
I many times will be walking through a store and somebody will stop me and say, "I bet you can't guess where we were today, 25 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 40 years ago, 50 years ago." And I could almost invariably say, well, I was probably photographing your wedding, right? And that's essentially what it was. I've also had a lot of people come to me and show me their old photographs that I took of them in the Aunt Mary Birthday Club program, or in some cases that I took of their parents in the Aunt Mary Birthday Club program. There's a good feeling of satisfaction. I was very saddened when the studio closed, because I did have a lot involved with it, but there were things happening that I could see that the studio was not going to survive. I could tell that, not because of the portrait part of it, but because of the other pieces of the studio that were involved at that time. And I had bought Don Bartel's studio 2 years before the studio closed, and it had moved into Don Bartel's studio, and I was there for 26 years. So got a lot of time in Grand Island, and I actually started photographing when I was 15 years old, helping an uncle photograph weddings. So,
wow.
You have a lot of memories, interesting things. I've got some stories that I wouldn't want to tell over the air.
Sure.
About things that happened at weddings, particularly.
Oh, I imagine.
But as far as, it's good to have people like the images that you take of them. It's nice to be part of that historical part of their family that will hopefully last for generations and generations. And then I'm also saddened by the fact that people that take all of these photographs now, all these digital photographs, very few of those are ever printed. I read a piece about photography. Fuji did a study about photography in the digital age, and there are over 1 billion photographs taken a day.
Wow.
Now,
in the world?
That are published in the world, yeah. And that are, some of them are published, they're saved to some sort of cloud media or whatever, but the number is 1 billion a day, and yet less than 1/100% of those images are ever printed. Wow. Ever printed.
Terry, thank you for being on the podcast. Stick around and we'll be back after these messages. This concludes another episode of the Stuhr Crazy podcast. Thanks for joining us this week.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Like I said, Terry is just one of those guys I could listen to talk about Grand Island history for a long time.
Yeah, and Carrie and Sam, always a pleasure to speak with them. I feel like we could have kept going for another couple hours.
Yeah, I think so. But that's most of the topics with you curator types. So,
yeah.
So what are we into next week? I think I smell something cooking, right?
Yeah, so you will for the next couple episodes, actually. Rest of the season 3 of Stuhr Crazy, has 2 episodes left. We're going to be talking about Thanksgiving in the next episode, and then to close out the season and the year 2020, thank God, we're going to be talking about Christmas and the history of Christmas.
If there's one thing Stuhr knows, it's the holidays. So we will be diving headfirst into it, and not a moment too soon as far as I'm concerned.
Believe me, it's all going to be gravy.
Great. All right, see you next week.